What if I told you that Mel Gibson almost didn't return as Max in Mad Max 2? Or that director George Miller nearly lost the entire ending footage in a car accident before the film was even finished? And here's the craziest part. The movie's most famous truck chase nearly killed the stunt driver who performed it. These are just the beginning. Stick with me as we uncover 25 of the weirdest, most unbelievable facts about Mad Max 2 that you've probably never heard before. Number 1. Mel Gibson almost didn't return as Max. It's hard to imagine anyone else but Mel Gibson as the Road Warrior, but believe it or not, the studio wasn't even sure if they wanted him back. After the first Mad Max, Gibson's career had barely started, and he was still considered too rough around the edges. Director George Miller had to fight to keep him in the role, because the studio wanted a more marketable star for international audience. If Miller hadn't insisted, we might never have seen Gibson in the role that made him an icon. Number 2. The villains were real bikers. The brutal biker gangs in Mad Max 2 looked terrifying on screen, and that's because many of them were actual outlaw bikers cast from the Australian desert. Miller didn't have the budget for big-name extras, so he hired local biker gangs to fill the role. They brought their own leather gear, their own bike, and their own wild energy. In fact, some crew members admitted they were genuinely afraid of them during filming because they didn't always stick to the script. Number 3. The stunts were shockingly real. Unlike modern films where CGI and wires keep stunt performers safe, Mad Max 2 went old school, with stunts that were terrifyingly real. One of the most famous crashes, where a biker flips end over end after hitting a car, was a genuine accident. The stuntman broke multiple bones, but survived. Instead of cutting it, Miller kept the footage in the final film because it looked so raw and authentic. That crash went on to become one of the most iconic shots in action cinema history. Number 4. The budget forced creative madness. With only about $4 million to work with, Mad Max 2 was tiny compared to Hollywood blockbusters of the time. Yet, this budget limitation is what gave the film its now iconic junkyard apocalypse aesthetic. Instead of looking cheap, it created a gritty, believable world that influenced decades of films to follow. Number 5. The dog was a rescue with no training. Remember Max's loyal dog, simply called Dog? That animal companion wasn't a professional film dog at all. In fact, he was rescued from a pound just days before he was scheduled to be euthanized. The crew trained him on set using food rewards and lots of patience, and he became such a fan favorite that audiences often say the dog steals every scene he's in. Behind the scenes, cast members admitted the entire crew fell in love with him, and he lived a long, happy life after filming wrapped. Number 6. The gyrocopter pilot was afraid of heights. One of the most memorable characters in Mad Max 2 is the eccentric gyrocopter pilot, played by Bruce Spence. Ironically, Spence had a terrible fear of heights in real life. Shooting scenes in the shaky, homemade-looking gyrocopter made him extremely nervous. The contraption barely had safety features and sometimes tilted dangerously while airborne. Spence later admitted that he tried to hide his fear with exaggerated expressions and odd humor, which only made the character more lovable and unforgettable. Number 7. George Miller took inspiration from samurai film. While many viewers see Mad Max 2 as a pure, post-apocalyptic action movie, director George Miller secretly modeled parts of it on classic Japanese samurai cinema. He admired Akira Kurosawa's storytelling, especially Seven Samurai. The idea of a lone warrior reluctantly defending a vulnerable community came directly from that influence. Even the way Miller staged wide shots of approaching enemies on the horizon mirrors Kurosawa's visual style. It's a strange but fascinating blend. Australian outback chaos meets Japanese honor-bound storytelling. Number 8. The famous truck chase nearly killed the stunt driver. The climax of the film, the tanker truck chase, is considered one of the greatest action sequences ever filmed, but it almost ended in tragedy. During one take, stunt driver Max Aspen lost control of the massive rig when it fishtailed at high speed. The tanker toppled over in the desert, rolling violently. Luckily, Aspen escaped with only minor injuries, but Miller decided to keep the footage in the film. What you see in the final cut is an actual crash, not planned choreography. That's why it looks so terrifyingly real. Number 9. Mel Gibson was paid almost nothing for the role. By today's standards, Mel Gibson's pay for Mad Max 2 is shocking. Despite being the star of one of the most anticipated sequels of the early 80s, Gibson was reportedly paid around $120,000 Australian dollars, a fraction of what Hollywood actors were making at the time. The film itself had a modest budget compared to American productions, so nearly all the money went into building vehicles and practical stunts. Ironically, this cheap role launched Gibson into global superstardom. Number 10. The villains' costumes came from punk clubs. Many of the bizarre leather outfits and spiked accessories worn by the Marauders weren't designed by a big Hollywood costume department. Instead, the wardrobe team raided Sydney's underground punk clubs and fetish shops for authentic clothing. Much of what you see on screen, studded harnesses, chains, and ripped leather, were actual outfits worn by real punks of the late 70s and early 80s. This gave the film's villains an incredibly raw, anarchic style that no studio-made costume could replicate. Number 11. Mel Gibson almost didn't speak in the film. Director George Miller originally envisioned Max as a silent drifter, a man whose actions spoke louder than words. The initial script had Max with only a handful of lines, barely speaking at all, but the studio grew nervous, fearing audiences wouldn't connect with such a quiet lead. In the final cut, Gibson had more dialogue, but even then, his lines were extremely sparse. He speaks fewer than 20 times in the entire film. This deliberate minimalism became one of the character's most iconic traits. Number 12. The film's vehicles were built from junkyard scraps. The cars and trucks in Mad Max 2 weren't designed with Hollywood budget. Instead, many of them were literally welded together from junkyard scraps around Sydney. The production team scavenged for old parts, bolted them into strange shapes, and spray-painted them into post-apocalyptic nightmares. Some vehicles were so fragile they could barely move without breaking down. The result, however, gave the film a gritty authenticity that CGI, or polished props, could never capture. Number 13. The dog was fed real kibble on set, but it was laced with live bullets. In Mad Max 2, Max has a loyal Australian cattle dog simply named Dog. The dog became a fan favorite, but there was one bizarre behind-the-scenes problem. The trainers used dog food as treats, but because they were filming in such remote and dusty conditions, live bullets often got mixed into the kibble bags that were lying around the set. Crew members had to carefully check the dog's food before every take to ensure he didn't accidentally swallow ammunition. It's one of the strangest on-set safety hazards in film history. Number 14. The explosions were so strong, they shook the town nearby. The film's climactic tanker chase featured massive practical explosions with no digital effects. Some of these blasts were so powerful they rattled windows in Silverton, the small mining town near the desert where the movie was filmed. Locals complained about their homes shaking, but the production pressed on, with Miller insisting that the raw, overwhelming destruction was essential to the movie's impact. Those explosions remain legendary for their scale and danger. Number 15. The film used real ammunition for sound effects. To capture authentic gunfire sounds, the crew didn't rely solely on studio Foley effects. Instead, they actually fired real guns into the desert and recorded the echoes bouncing across the barren landscape. These recordings were later mixed with theatrical effects to create the film's distinctive, thunderous sound design. In an age before advanced sound libraries, this hands-on approach gave Mad Max 2 an audio realism that audiences subconsciously felt in every gunfight. Number 16. The oil tanker was actually full of water, not fuel. One of the biggest reveals in Mad Max 2 is that the survivors are desperately protecting a massive oil tanker full of precious gasoline. But here's the weird truth. In real life, the tanker wasn't carrying fuel at all. For safety reasons, it was actually filled with thousands of liters of plain water. George Miller knew that if they'd used real fuel, the explosions and crashes could have turned deadly in seconds. This clever trick meant the crew could shoot the action without worrying about catastrophic fire hazards, while audiences still believed every drop inside was gasoline. Number 17. The villain, Wes, wore pink mohawk hair as a last-minute decision. Vernon Wells, who played the psychotic Wes, originally had a different hairstyle planned, but just days before filming, the crew decided to shave his head on the sides and give him a bright pink mohawk. What's funny is that Wells hated the haircut at first. He thought it made him look ridiculous, but it ended up being one of the most iconic villain looks of the 80s and inspired countless punk and comic book characters afterward. Number 18. The Gyro Captain wasn't supposed to survive the movie. Bruce Spence's quirky Gyro Captain became a fan favorite for his eccentric mannerisms and loyalty to Max. But in the original drafts of the script, the character was killed off during the oil tanker chase. Test screenings, however, showed that audiences loved him so much that George Miller re-edited the ending to let him live, even making him the narrator of the story. Without this change, fans would have lost one of the most unusual and memorable characters in the film. Number 19. George Miller nearly lost the entire ending footage in a car accident. After filming the epic oil tanker chase, Miller and his editor were transporting reels of film in a car. On the way back, the vehicle was involved in a small crash, and for a moment, Miller thought the entire climax of Mad Max 2 might be destroyed before it could even reach the editing room. Luckily, the film canisters were dented but intact, saving what would become one of the greatest chase sequences in cinema history. Number 20. The Humongous' mask came from a medical supply store. The main villain, Lord Humongous, wears a terrifying metal hockey-like mask. Fans assumed it was custom design, but in reality, the production team bought it from a medical supply store where it was sold as a protective brace for patients with head injuries. They spray-painted it silver, added some leather straps, and suddenly it became one of the most iconic post-apocalyptic looks ever put on screen. Number 21. George Miller wanted no script for extras. One of the strangest things George Miller did during filming was to deliberately avoid giving many of the extras a traditional script. Instead, he explained their roles and motives in broad strokes, then set them loose in the wasteland environment. This method gave the marauders, settlers, and drifters a raw, unpredictable energy, because they weren't acting in the usual sense. They were improvising how desperate or violent people might actually behave in such a world. That chaotic realism made the background feel alive and dangerous, even when the focus wasn't on the main character. Number 22. George Miller studied silent films for inspiration. To capture the film's unique energy, director George Miller studied the works of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. He admired how silent-era comedies created tension and humor through pure visual storytelling. Many of the chase sequences in Mad Max 2 are structured exactly like old silent films, with escalating setups, physical stunts, and climaxes that play out without heavy dialogue. This influence explains why the movie feels almost universal, able to be understood even without subtitle. Number 23. Bruce Spence was chosen for his height. Bruce Spence, who played the Gyro Captain, had a very unusual casting journey. Miller admitted that one of the main reasons Spence was chosen was because of his extraordinary height and thin frame. He stood at 6 feet 6 inches and had an almost skeletal look that made him seem otherworldly. This unique physicality gave his character a strange, comedic, yet eerie presence, perfect for the bizarre wasteland world of Mad Max. Number 24. The film was accused of being too violent for society. When Mad Max 2 premiered, some critics claimed the film was so violent it could negatively influence society. In certain countries, it was censored or banned outright because of its brutality and bleakness. Ironically, this controversy only fueled its cult status. Fans sought it out specifically because it felt like forbidden cinema, dangerous, raw, and unlike anything else showing in theaters at the time. Number 25. The entire film cost less than a Hollywood comedy. Despite its epic feel and groundbreaking action, Mad Max 2 was made on a budget of only $4 million, far less than most Hollywood comedies of the time. To put that in perspective, movies like Stripes and Ghostbusters had budgets multiple times larger. Miller's crew achieved blockbuster-level stunts on a shoestring by relying on real crashes, practical effects, and daring performers instead of Hollywood trickery. That's why the movie looks so raw and authentic, even today.